That's me. So I'm skipping this and I'm going straight to this one. Most of us in this room use open source every day. That is not news. We've heard it from every single speaker here. But what's easy to miss, I think, is how we're using it. If you picked up any app that you regularly use for your bank, your hospital, your car, we've seen examples of other things here, and asked the developers for a full bill of materials of what's inside of it, what software that application depends on, that it's built on top of, that list would be long, it would be indirect, and it would be changing with every modification, every update that we make. Not because we forgot the code that we wrote, but it's because the software that we build today is never written from scratch. It's built on layers of other software, libraries, frameworks, runtimes at this point, models, most of which we didn't write. And once that software is deployed, it often just sits there, sometimes for years, often without being rebuilt, often without being updated. Risk assessments happen once, but are they happening again and again every time a dependency upstream changes? I suggest here that we think of open source not only as the software that we're actively working on, but the software, it's the software that we assume will keep working quietly, invisibly, underneath everything else. And that is how I'm now returning to what Claire brought up in the beginning. We're returning to the roads from the opening remarks. That is what infrastructure is. Once you depend on something this way, the questions change. Do we know what's actually in it? Would we know how to rebuild it if we had to? And would we know how to fix it? Not just once, but continuously. That's why this distinction matters. So, let me see if I can go to the next slide. There we go. So we usually think of open source in terms of licenses and community activity. I think we've seen here, Sarah was talking about that it's not just code, it's made of people from all over the world. Obviously, all of this still matters. It is the foundation of open source software, after all. And in fact, those were the previous roles that were hinted to. I used to work in open source community management, product management, and then I've sort of slipped into this tech world a little more and more. I think that's the story for a lot of us. But again, there's this third aspect that we tend to think a little less about, the infrastructure that makes open source trustworthy at scale. And it's something that's come up a little bit in these talks, and I want to focus us in on that a little bit more. So again, having a clear understanding of how software is produced and updated, how fixes actually reach users, how trust is established when not one single person is in charge, and at times maybe the project doesn't even have people that are maintaining it. And what happens when something then breaks downstream? We've seen through the talks here today that we've built social and legal structures for sharing code. We can discuss, how well defined they are or how legal they are. But my point here is that we did not build operational structures needed to depend on this code. So with open source, whether with this global reach or smaller packages built into your software, it isn't just code. It's making up this larger operating model. And like any operating model, it can succeed or fail based on how well that infrastructure actually holds up. So what is it that's changed in the last few years? I would say that there's not just more open source software, it's the way that we're consuming it, right? We've heard it a little bit here today, and I just want to sort of pull that out. Most software today is assembled automatically, right? Code pulls in dependencies on its own. Systems rebuild and redeploy constantly, often without our intervention. Same with updates. They flow through, sometimes without a human even touching them. And more recently, and maybe you've read the news today, there are new models coming out, every day. We now have code authoring AI tools that are generating entirely new code bases and pulling in these dependencies at speeds that we don't even recognize, right? Like it's just creating these lists of all of the software that we're depending on. But at the same time, this trust model hasn't really changed. We're still relying on human manual reviews of the code. We're relying on security engineers or software engineers that sit there and do their best effort maintenance, stressed out because the legislation and regulation is pushing faster and harder in a good way. but we also have a fuzzy sense of who's responsible for what. And in this gap between this automated production and consumption on the one hand and the manual trust on the other, that's where this risk, I think, can accumulate. And it's not because open source is bad, but it's because that operating at this scale and the speed that we're seeing today, I think is breaking the assumptions of how this was supposed to work in the first place. So sometimes we hear skeptics ask, can we use open source safely? And I think that is the wrong question, because today we're actually very good at finding the problems. We see more and more vulnerabilities reported every year, not because software is getting worse, not because we're getting worse at writing software, because we're finally looking at it at scale. So analysts expect this trend to continue. Organizations are already responding by shifting more security spend earlier in the life cycle, right? Like we're prioritizing prevention rather than reaction. And we're seeing the new regulations that I hinted at, raising the bar on transparency and accountability. We see it in the CRA, we see it in DORA, and we see it in all these regulations that are coming up. And I think that reflects how critical the software has become. And yet, despite all of that, the hardest questions often remain unanswered. What happens when something breaks or a vulnerability shows up? And in many organizations today, those questions are answered late or not at all, and often at the cost of developer velocity or their sanity. And so I think that the real question is not, can we use open source safely? It's how do we responsibly depend on open source? And if we accept that open source is this sort of critical infrastructure, then we see these sort of patterns emerge. These are just some ideas that we have at Chainguard about making trust boring, automated, and reliable, right? Like we don't want developers to actually spend time on thinking about these things. We want to create sort of a caring open source ecosystem as this critical infrastructure that deals with this in a boring and hopefully somewhat automated way, because in that saving the sanity and the velocity of the developers, that's where this innovation really emerges. Let's see if I'm on the right slide. Am I? Yes. So one reason I joined Chainguard from academia, I was in higher education for 20 years, is that we're trying to apply these ideas in practice. We rebuild open source software from source. We're automating patching and updates, but also crucially, we make our tooling open, transparent. We're doing it in the open. We're learning as we go. We're working together with the community. And we're one attempt among others that are addressing this problem. And like the others, we're taking this responsibility seriously, and we do it at scale without slowing people down. And like I said, I think that is how innovation happens, giving people time to actually write code, innovate, think about new things, new ways that we're going to do things in this world. And importantly, like I hinted at, none of this works without the broader open source community. We're not separate from it, we're downstream of it, and we keep making contributions upstream. So I will just leave it with this. Open source isn't just something that we use, it's something that we all rely on. Once something becomes infrastructure like this, the question shifts from can we use open source safely to how do we responsibly depend on open source? And answering that, I think, in a collaborative way, in ways that we've seen here through the talks, is one of the most important challenges that we have as a community. And if you do buy that open source is critical infrastructure, then treating it like one is a shared responsibility among us in the room. It's the place where I think that you saw Claire talk in the beginning, like this is a place where I think that Ireland can be a true thought leader. And I think you need to treat it as this shared responsibility, whether you're a maintainer, a user, an organization, a company working in the space, and potentially even a country, right? So if you want to talk more about how we solve these big issues together, these sort of threats that are on the horizon, the regulation that is trying to work with this, come talk to me or any of my wonderful colleagues, like Frank also said. I don't know where Frank went. Over there. We also brought our engineers, and so if you are an engineer or dev, you can talk to our colleagues back there. We're very excited to talk about the technologies that we're building alongside the open source community. And yeah, you have the QR code here to my LinkedIn as well. Thank you to the organizers for giving me the opportunity to speak, and thank you all for listening.